It's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Eric Labs. Dr. Labs is a senior analyst for naval forces and weapons at the Congressional Budget Office. He specializes in issues related to the procurement, budgeting, and sizing of forces for the Department of the Navy. Eric has testified before Congress numerous times and published many reports under the auspices of the Congressional Budget Office, as well as articles and papers in academic journals and conferences, including the U.S. Naval Institute's Proceedings, as well as Sea Power Magazine, the Naval War College Review, and Security Studies. So I will now turn it over to Eric to kick off today's conference.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'll wait for my slides to load up here, but I can start with a couple of remarks that don't rely on the slides. First of all, I want to thank the Naval Institute for inviting me here today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk before you, and hopefully what I have to say, you will find something of value. These remarks are my own. They do not reflect those of the Congressional Budget Office or the U.S. Congress. And consistent with CBO policy, I will present some options so as to hopefully enrich the discussion, but will not be making any recommendations. So, unfortunately, I'm here to tell you something that many of you already know. The state of naval shipbuilding in the United States today is not good. In fact, it is the worst it has been in nearly the 30 years that I have been CBO's naval analyst. The ships that the Navy buys and the industry that builds them are excellent, but costs are rising across the board and delivery schedules are slipping dramatically. To that point, I will talk briefly about four things: how we got to where we are today, a few words on the Navy's 2025 shipbuilding plan, the state of the shipbuilding industrial base now, and what we can do about it. So these are the topics I'm going to address, and then I want to start off with congressional support for shipbuilding, but this slide in particular. Ever since Congress required the Navy to submit a 30-year shipbuilding plan to Congress, it has been much more aspirational than reality. I mean, look at this chart. This is the problem statement, is it not? Most people who look at the geopolitical challenge posed by the People's Republic of China, a totalitarian communist dictatorship, conclude that, among other things, we need a larger Navy. Indeed, a much larger Navy than we currently have, which stands at 295 ships today. But despite shipbuilding plan after shipbuilding plan, advocating, proposing to build a larger fleet, we never seem to get there, or even close in any meaningful way. Sure, we are above the nadir of the 2000s, which was 271 ships, but under the current plan, we're going back down to 283 ships in 2026, which doesn't count the prospect of a number of layups of support ships. And that 283 will only be as high as it is because of congressional intervention over the years and the Navy's decision to extend the service life of 3 Ticonderoga-class cruisers in recent days. We've been playing this dance now for more than 13 years, and the music never changes. Why? There are several reasons. For a long time, the challenge to building a larger fleet was budgets. The Navy would lose out on the competition for resources within the Department of Defense as we fought multiple land wars in Asia. Administrations of both parties would request relatively small shipbuilding budgets, and the Congress would appropriate close to those requests. But then, as concern over China rose and the concern over what the replacement of our sea-based strategic deterrent would cost, and thus what it would do to the shipbuilding budgets began to rise. Requests for larger shipbuilding budgets became a feature of the DoD budget starting in 2016, which I might add, was still in the middle of the Budget Control Act era. And the Congress enthusiastically supported increasing shipbuilding by adding substantially to the administration's request year in and year out, and every year between 2013 and 2024. 2025 remains an open question. The bloom is off the rose a little bit there, but we'll have to see how that plays out. We can talk about that more in the Q&A if you like. So much so has Congress been supportive of shipbuilding that when you look at the past 20 years, the SCN budget grew by nearly twice the rate of shipbuilding inflation and by more than 2.5 times the rate of inflation in the economy as a whole. Now, to be sure, content was being added to the SCN budget too, but it cannot be said that an awful lot of money wasn't being appropriated by the Congress in recognition of the need for a larger fleet over the past 20 years. In 2011, many people were concerned that with a $14 billion SCN budget, A boomer replacement that costs $8 billion would consume over half the budget. Well, we are at $8 billion boomers today, and based on the 2025 FIDIP, they consume about a quarter of the SCN budget that has more than doubled. In my view, the funding challenge of Columbia is largely being met by the Congress. But I want to move now to the Navy's 2025 shipbuilding plan. Under the 2025 plan, the Navy would build a larger fleet, faster than under any alternative under the 2024 shipbuilding plan. And this is perhaps not particularly surprising, given the demands that the Navy is facing and the prospect of needing a larger fleet. What is a bit more surprising here is that the Navy gets there by buying more current generation ships and fewer next generation ships than such that the 2025 fleet ends up being less capable by several of the Navy's metrics than the fleets under the 2024 plan. I don't have the metrics here. They will be published they are published in the Navy shipbuilding report, but I'm going to be publishing them in my shipbuilding report in early January. But the fact is, on a number of measures, the capability is less, the ship quantities are more, and costs are higher. Indeed, costs are leading to this larger fleet does lead to sort of a more expensive budget. CBO, as I said, is in a few weeks. We're going to publish the 2025 shipbuilding plan, but the total budget required to implement that plan is, not surprisingly, greater than last year's sort of choose your own adventure shipbuilding plan of the 2024 report. The Navy's total budget would need to grow in real terms, that is, removing the effects of inflation, over time from $255 billion today to about $350 billion by 2054. Now let me shift the conversation a little bit to the shipbuilding industrial base. As the money flowed from the Congress for the larger fleet, the aggregate demand signal to industry became quite substantial. And while admittedly on a year-to-year basis it sometimes could look confusing with the presence of continuing resolutions and the like, the demand signal was still larger, and for submarines in particular, it became actually in many ways too much, too fast. That, combined with societal trends that discourage people from seeking employment in heavy industry and the disruptions and accelerations of those trends caused by COVID, budgets became less of a constraint, and challenges in the execution of shipbuilding programs caused costs to rise and now schedules to slip. But that growth was concentrated in carriers, submarines, and logistics and support ships. Amphibious warfare ships really had the opposite problem, with a weak demand signal from the Navy and repeated congressional interventions to first boost amphibious ship production, and then to set the requirement for those ships into law. The Secretary of the Navy released the results of his 45-day shipbuilding review this past April, which shined a very bright light on these issues, but ship construction delays were baked in well before that. The 2025 shipbuilding plan will now take those challenges and extend them to a higher level. Let me just stop for a moment and briefly explain how I do this slide. The way I do this slide is that I use light ship displacement and condition A1 weight for submarines and divide that with the time span. So a 10,000-ton ship that takes 5 years to build gets 2,000 tons in each of the year that this chart indicates. So the aggregate shipbuilding tonnage for the Navy's combat ships will increase by over 40% compared to today, which would then come on top of nearly a 70% increase since 2014. However, this coming growth will be concentrated in combat ships. As the chart shows, logistics and support ships will face a different problem, with a potential boom and bust cycle actually coming over the next 20 years. I want to zero in now a little bit on the submarine industrial base. After suffering the most acute and painful challenge of any sector in shipbuilding over the past half-dozen years, it is going to face the same challenge yet again, despite the current problems are still being unresolved. Between 2009 and 2024, the amount of submarine tonnage under construction nearly tripled, with Columbia being the Navy's #1 acquisition priority, and therefore gets the first claim on the best workers and the most skilled workers, the best and most skilled managers, as well as parts and materials. The result is construction times for attack submarines are growing substantially. In the Navy's 2025 budget documents, SSNs are projected to take 8, 9, and some as many as 10 years to build. And I suspect the 2026 budget documents will likely show further deterioration in some of those construction schedules. The 2025 shipbuilding plan, this is without AUKUS, would result in roughly a 75% increase in demand for submarine tonnage by the early 2030s, and it will compared to today, and it will stay in that range for the better part of a decade. Only once we get past Columbia, if we get past Columbia, does that demand on the submarine industrial base begin to ease. And I say if because we don't actually know in the future how many boomers we will actually the Navy will actually require compared to what it is currently planning for. Now, if you introduce AUKUS into the equation, where you build 5 replacement submarines in 2030s and 2040s, then that is going to add to that burden with the higher portion of it being extended a little bit further and a little bit longer. And my assumption in this chart is that the replacements for AUKUS are Virginia-class submarines. If they turn out to be SSNXs, the next generation submarines, then the burden is actually going to be higher because that is going to be very much likely a larger submarine. The sum result of all of this is that we find ourselves, unfortunately, with a smaller fleet than what anyone had ever intended. The difficulty in hiring and retaining shipyard workers, naval architects, and engineers in the entirety of the naval enterprise, as well as the growth in the demand for naval construction, has led to the executability challenges pretty much across the board. As naval ship construction executability has declined, the fleet did not grow as anticipated and actually became and will become smaller. To be sure, more and more ships being retired before the end of their service lives also contributed to that problem, but the gap that we are seeing here is driven in large measure by the decline in, by the scheduled ships as a result of the decline of executability. Between 2020 and 2040, the gap between the fleet that the Navy would have had and the actual and currently projected fleet is 231 ship years. Between 2027 and 2030 in particular, the gap is actually about 20 ships in each of those years compared to what it could have been, most of which are submarines and destroyers that are not there, which are critical platforms in any potential confrontation with China. And now we are in a vicious cycle. Executability is challenging, and that is leading to more schedule slips, more man hours, and thus more costs. Indeed, costs are now rising substantially, in some cases dramatically and shockingly. In the 2024 FYDP, the Navy reported $3.4 billion in cost overruns or cost to complete bills. In the 2025 FYDP, comparing the same years and the same ships as the 2024 FYDP, that figure has now grown to over $10 billion. I'm including in that the money the Navy needs to fully fund the 2024 and 2025 attack submarines, as well as the $1.7 billion for DDG-51s that the Navy has characterized as subsequent full-year funding, which is just cost overruns by another name. And we're still not done. That amount does not yet count for the substantial shortfalls in submarines in fiscal year 2026 and beyond that you may have read about in press report in recent weeks. My remarks today are limited to just the numbers that are already in official government documents. The question is now, what can we do about it? How can we sort of start doing what the CNO says she wants to do, which is to get more players on the field? The question that comes up, and that is the question that is confronting us all right now. Last year, speaking in this same spot, my colleague at CRS, Ron O'Rourke, offered a well-developed argument about how the Navy and industry need to rethink how to design, build, and maintain and cruise ships. He emphasized, in particular, the need for the Navy to engage in upfront, end-to-end design of what I call the naval enterprise, and to think about how that design will fit into American society, workforce, and industrial base that we have, not the one we wish we had. If you haven't seen his argumentation on the topic, I commend it to you. But a challenge of Ron's approach, and he would be the first to tell you this, is that it is the long game, and it will take decades to fully implement. Here I will ask what can be done in the near term in light of the issues I have outlined to get to a larger fleet and a better functioning industrial base. There are several options that the Navy can consider to get, in the words of the CNO, more players in the field. One is the Navy sort of diversifies its shipbuilding program towards a small, for example, a small missile corvette is one option. This is not an option that's unique with me. I've talked about it several times in several reports over the years, but many other analysts in town have as well. Rather than going down the LUSV path, the Navy could go down a path where it does this manned corvette, and perhaps when the technology matures, it could pursue an optionally unmanned platform in a way that is more the adjunct magazine that the Navy hopes for. But in the meantime, a small, well-armed missile corvette could provide a lot more capability to the Navy over a broader distributed firepower that it seeks to have. Now, the pros of that are sort of what I just explained in terms of naval shipbuilding, and they would be relatively less expensive to build than anything the Navy is currently building. Not that they would be cheap, but they would be less than a frigate and they would be less than a destroyer. But that's going to still require some time. You're going to have to design the ship. Smaller yards are going to have a steep learning curve to get up to learn how to build those ships. So it's not a cure-all, but it is an opportunity for the naval enterprise to diversify its portfolio, if you will. A second concept that various people have talked about is the idea of retrofitting VLS cells onto other existing Navy ships. The LPD-17 was designed to accommodate 16 VLS cells. They could be retrofitted to incorporate them, and they could canisterize and put VLS, put canisterized missiles on logistics and support ships. Some people have used the expression arm everything you can. The idea is to get as distributed a fleet with as much firepower as you can possibly do with the assets that you have. That too is something that can be done in a relatively short period of time compared to the time required to build a destroyer, which is now in the range of 7 years, or a submarine, which is in the range of 9 years. And last, as some people have proposed in the past, you could buy small merchant ships and you could equip them with canisterized missiles, or if you want to spend a little bit more money, you could put VLS cells in those ships. Those have disadvantages too. The Navy would have to crew those ships. Those could not be run by civilian mariners. They would certainly not have much in the way of a self-defense capability or any sort of ability to resist any potential attack that might come to them. But nonetheless, if you were looking for a relatively fast, a relatively inexpensive way to put a lot more platforms at sea that carry anti-ship missiles and other functions that can serve for a conflict with China, then that might be another option that the Navy could consider. This is my last substantive slide. And the other issue, of course, is what do you do about this shipbuilding industrial base? Over the past 3 years, I can say that I've been fortunate that CBO has sent me to visit many of the private and public yards that the Navy uses to perform their work, the new construction work and to perform their maintenance work in the continental United States. I have not yet been able to convince them to send me to Hawaii, but there's hope for the future. In my view, the challenges facing the Navy shipyards are mostly, but not entirely, but mostly about getting more workers in them and keeping them when they have them. And how can we do that? These are 4 items that need to be discussed in more detail and more broadly. We are moving in that direction to already do so, but we need to increase wages and benefits in the shipyards. You want to be able to improve working conditions for them. You want to increase the supply of workers. As it turns out today that anybody working on a U.S. Navy shipbuilding program has to have citizenship status. They must be U.S. citizens. There may be basis for relaxing that rule a little bit for green card holders or what have you, to get more workers into the yards. Another would be to increase the advertising and outreach to workers so that you can get more people from different parts of the country that are interested in working in shipyards. Right now we have a situation where the attrition in many of the shipyards is in 20 to 22% for your average worker. And some of the critical trades, it's as high as 30% or more. There is no way to improve the condition of the shipbuilding industrial base with attrition rates that high. You're not going to get the skills that you're going to need. You're not going to get the improvement in your work. You're not going to get, therefore, the costs and labor hours to come down without that. Improving the working conditions is something that can occur literally when I was riding around the New England area, and we'd drive past a sign that said, this was 2 to 3 years ago. You've heard these stories, but it's true. Subway was advertising $18 an hour plus benefits. The shipyard, the adjacent shipyards at that time were offering $21 an hour to sort of entry-level workers. If you've got a choice between working inside a Subway versus working out in the hot and the cold of a shipyard, if you're 18, 19, or 20 years old, coming out of a trade school or maybe a 2-year community college program, and you're not necessarily thinking about a long-term career and what might get you sort of advancement over time, that can look pretty compelling to work in the more comfortable environment. And that is something, to the extent that we can invest in the shipyards to do that, to cover more stuff, move more stuff inside, to improve those working conditions, but especially to raise pay in a very substantial way to compensate for the fact that working conditions in those yards are worse than almost any other manufacturing sector you can think of. That is something that we need to do, it seems to me. Ron and I have been discussing the need for these kinds of solutions for some time. His report on Navy shipbuilding includes short write-ups on these options, as well as a number of others that can be considered in the near term. I'm personally convinced that the Navy and industry will never overcome the challenges that they are in without at least some, if not all, of the ones that I've listed here. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and attention. I hope you find this of value, and I'm happy to look forward to and talk about any questions that you may have. Yes, sir.
Ben Massengill with the Stimson Center. Sir, your third COA for trying to increase the size of the fighting force of the Navy involves trying to get merchant ships and arming those. Has there any been analysis to see, given the limited size of the ocean-going U.S. merchant marine, that even these private civilian yards could even produce numbers that would make any dent in our need for ships? Has there been analysis on that?
I have not done any analysis on that. This was the first I read of this proposal was some years ago in Proceedings magazine, where this was an idea, and this would be a sort of smaller merchant ships. It wouldn't be sort of the larger ones you need, for example, in the Ready Reserve Fleet, because you don't obviously want to put hundreds of missiles on one of these types of platforms. You want to just put a relatively smaller number of that. I don't know what the current condition is of the availability of smaller used merchant ships out there. So that would be something that would obviously have to be taken into consideration and to make that work effectively. But even if you're only talking about 10 or 20 ships, that puts a much higher degree of diversity on the anti-ship missile force that the United States Navy could put to sea in the Pacific as a result of that. More distributed firepower, if that's the name of the game, I'm willing to look for any option that might contribute to that process.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning, Dr. Lobbs. Don Klein from Thayer Mahan. I'm a naval aviator asking you a shipbuilding question. So, looking at the location of some of our shipyards, they're not exactly in the most robust hiring areas with access to trained personnel. Pascagoula has a finite number of workers. Marinette certainly is in not a very populated area. Have we given any consideration to modular construction, much like Columbia, where portions of Columbia are being built in Newport and then sent to Electric Boat for final assembly? If we took that model and extrapolated it out to other platforms, you might have access to more robust labor markets than you do based on the current location of traditional shipyards.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, I quite agree with that. That is one of the other options that Ron has talked about a lot in his report and some of his remarks as well, and that is something that certainly the submarine industry is doing in a rather substantial proportion. If you look at sort of the labor hours that are kind of needed to perform the workload that they have for them, they're going to outsource as much as 50% more in terms of labor hours if they went to places like Austell, which is one of the big focus factories for that. So to the extent that that is something, I kind of take that as a given now, as something that the Navy is pursuing actively and aggressively. Can you expand that, or should you expand that to other shipbuilding programs? Sure, to the extent that the opportunities are available and the priorities are met accordingly. There's no reason why you can't do that for any other kind of shipbuilding program. The issue, of course, becomes it's not the ideal way to build a ship. I mean, obviously, when you talk to the yards, there have been challenges in doing this kind of approach, but we're at that point in time where they don't really have any choice, because as you say, the labor markets are not there where the yards are, so they're going to have to find labor in other sources where the labor is available, and to do exactly just say modular construction. Ron's had some good talks about that, where he explains, we've done it in the past with LPD-17 after Katrina. We're doing it a lot for submarines now, and we're only going to do that more and more in the future. So yes. Mark?
You.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please.
Hi, Rebecca Ganska with SMI. In terms of your second COA, which was essentially build smaller ships or build ships a little cheaper until we find a more refined ship to build. In terms of that option, we saw the Marine Corps with the landing ship medium attempt to do that exact thing with building a cheap ship that we can get out fast and get the Marines on it. that kind of fell through this meandering role in the building that kind of led to no solution. So from your perspective, how do you prevent that from occurring again? Is that a congressional directed thing? Is that a CAPE/the building problem? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's a very good question. And the medium landing ship is a program I had to write the Congress asked me to write a specific report on that back in the spring. And that was definitely an example of where it seems like from what I can see from the outside, and no inside baseball here, is that the Marines had sort of one vision of that program, and the Navy then seemed to have a different vision for that program. And we're at a point where one vision seems to be more like the Navy's, but the costs associated with them seem to be more like what the Marine Corps had in mind, and those are not exactly compatible with each other. I think for one thing that the concept, one of the issues behind the LSM program was the Marine Corps' operating concept behind it. There was questions in the Hill, there was questions in DOD as to sort of how effective that would be. But to your point about building a smaller ship and how do we prevent it from going down that same sort of path, is that I think that leadership's got to come both from DOD and from Capitol Hill. In other words, if you want to build a small combatant, first thing you have to do is you're going to have some sort of configuration control. You have to accept the fact that it can't be all things to all people. It can't do all the missions that a large destroyer or even a large frigate can do, because what we're building is a large multi-mission frigate. The idea behind this is much more, dare I say it, the original concept behind LCS, which is sort of a focused mission ship, but a focused mission that is primarily there to provide additional magazine and missile capacity to the Navy, and not necessarily do a whole lot else. If you don't have the discipline that comes from inside the building to do that, then you're right, then that program could just as easily fall by the wayside the way other programs have in the past. But at the same time, to get a larger, more distributed fleet, I don't see how you do that without some sort of smaller missile combatant to do that, to get you there.
Thanks. Dr. Labs, Mark Vandroff from Fincantieri Marinette Marine. I'm going to ask a question with some risk here that you will ask it back at me during my panel.
I plan to stay for your panel.
For the different options for workforce, one that I didn't see, and I'd be interested in your thoughts or if you've looked at it, is to what degree can more shipyard work that's currently being done by a human being be automated in the future?
Well, I am definitely not an expert to be able to tell you that, other than to agree that in general principle that the more automation that we can do, basically the application of any technology to ship construction that allows you to reduce the quantity of labor hours that you need to build any given ship can only work to the good. So to the extent that we can learn from other shipyards, our friends and allies, and to apply that into U.S. shipyards, we certainly should do that, because the serious constraint of where we are in the shipbuilding industrial base is labor, in my view. So anything that we can do to alleviate that pressure from every angle that you can think of, I agree with that. I didn't include it in this talk, not because I don't think it's important, but just because I didn't want to sort of go through a list of 10 or 15 things. I wanted to sort of focus on ones that I think matter the most and can have the most remedial, immediate effect. And there are a few that I think can meet that category better than wage increases for the shipyard workers. I mean, that's going to come with a penalty, of course. That means your ships are going to be more expensive, at least as you transition to get those more experienced workers. And then hopefully over time, the number of labor hours that you need to build the ship therefore will come down as those workers are more experienced, even if they're more highly paid. But that's going to be, a challenging transition. But we don't dig ourselves out of 10-year submarine builds or 7 or 8-year destroyer builds without doing something to those effects.
Eric, good morning. Gregory Glaros. Could you touch on the value or the benefit of the $2.4 billion award to Deloitte for effectively studying how to hire more shipbuilders? And should that be offered as a sacrificial lamb to the Department of Government Efficiencies?
That's not a loaded question. There's not a lot I can, in my position, that I can sort of, comment on that. I mean, the one thing I will observe is that, as I understand the value of that contract, it is mostly a pass-through exercise in the sense that the Navy has contracted, and if there's anybody in this room who knows this better than I, feel free to answer it, is a pass-through exercise where the Deloitte is kind of managing, for a fee, of course, a lot of investments in the submarine industrial base. So it's not like we're going to pay Deloitte $2.4 billion and they are going to produce themselves $2.4 billion worth of products or goods for the submarine industrial base. It is more that they are acting as the Navy's agent, if you will, for a whole range of activities. Are they the best company for that, or should somebody else be doing it? Should the Navy be doing it? I don't have answers to those questions because honestly, I'm really just not in a position to comment further. Bill.
Eric, yeah, Bill Hamlet, Naval Institute Proceedings. Every senior officer that I hear speak always mentions, allies and partners as an American superpower, right? Our allies and partners, we do everything by, with, and through allies and partners. There's been conversations, and the SecNav has talked about this, about building ships or having allies and partners perhaps build some hulls for the United States Navy. There's pushback in Congress on that. You mentioned in your brief the idea of a DDC or a small missile combatant. Several of our allies and partners build really beautiful ones, right? Very capable small missile combatants. What are your thoughts on the possibility that one of the future COAs that gets us out of this gap is actually buying foreign ships or being able to speed up the ability to buy a foreign design and build it here in the United States?
Well, I'll start off with saying my idea behind a DDC, and you're right, that's exactly what I had in mind, was that there were other smaller yards in the United States that could actually build those that would not contribute to the burdens of the existing shipyards. So my thought was sort of, there are other shipyards that can build small combatants like that. It's going to take them some time to learn how to do it, but we could diversify the shipbuilding portfolio if the demand signal is going to remain as large as it is for the foreseeable future. And you're not wrong in everything you said about many of our friends and allies. They produce some very, pretty nice, missile corvettes and like that. I'm going to defer to the Congress. The Congress has a very strong view on this issue, and certainly to do that would require a change in the law, because right now it is prohibited by law to buy foreign ships like that from overseas, regardless of how close a friend and ally that we have. Whether we find ourselves down the road that more options need to be on the table than that are already there, that sort of remains to be seen. But I'm going to defer to the Congress and their judgment on that.
Hi, Sam Legrone, USA News. We're talking a lot about the shipyard workers that need to, build and new construction. I'm curious as to how much of your analysis deals with the labor force that does repair and maintenance, and then additionally, if we're talking about, the Congressional language is 355 ships. That's a lot of new sailors that are part of that, too, that are just a tremendous expense. Is that part of kind of the consideration of what y'all are looking at, or just mostly the tonnage?
So most of the work that I do for CBO does focus on the new construction side of things. I do have a colleague who does more analytic work than I do on the maintenance side of the equation. He's done some work on submarines. I contribute to his analysis, but he's very much the lead in that, and he's got one on the surface ship maintenance that is in draft form right now. So I don't do as much with the maintenance side as perhaps I wish I could because of the limitations on time. In terms of actually, Sam, what was the second part of your question on that?
Just the manpower that you would need.
The power issue. So we'll take it back to Mark's comment about technology. There's another place where technology should be incorporated into new construction Navy ships, whereby to the extent that you can reduce crew sizes on ships in a sensible and a safe way. We've tried this in the past in ways that maybe did not make sense, but as technology moves forward, we should be looking to sort of reduce crew sizes. They were able to successfully do it on the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the Ford. The DDG-1000 has a substantially smaller crew size than the DDG-51. So to the extent that we can continue to incorporate technology in that to reduce the number of sailors required for the fleet, again, that's going to be good because truly, as the statement is true, that manpower is the most precious resource. That's true in the shipyards, and that's true for the sailors, because you need the crew, you need the sailors to be able to crew these ships that the Navy wants to build in much larger numbers. So anything that can be done in that direction, I think, is something that ought to be actively pursued.
Hi, Sully, old guy. Focusing on small missile-armed corvettes, et cetera. So our history is we decommissioned all of PG-84 Asheville class early. The PCs were ready to go out at the start of the War on Terror, and we hung around. We had 6 hydrofoil PHMs that had they had harpoons on them and a 76 millimeter gun. They were pretty up-armored. We have failed to up-armor both classes of LCS. So what's the rationale for, hey, if we really want a distributed fleet with missiles, how is our Navy going to accept the latest iteration of where we have a history of shutting down those classes early in the past?
I guess I would answer that in 2 ways. One is the kind of missile corvette I have in mind is not the same thing as a PC or a hydrofoil. It is certainly, it's an ocean-going ship that would be somewhere in the 3,000 to 4,000 ton range and carry anywhere from 16 to 32 VLS cells. I mean, if you think about what the LUSV, which press reports indicate that we're not sure how well that's succeeding, it will succeed in the next budget go-around. But if you think of the LUSV, which was going to be approximately a 2,000-ton platform with 32 VLS cells, if you make that a little bit larger to accommodate the hotel services that would be required for a crew, it starts to look like a real Navy ship, in my opinion. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say to that is that look at the state of the current programs right now. We've got 10,000-ton destroyers. We've had a frigate program because that has grown by 500 tons, so much so that the lead frigate is going to weigh almost as much as the first Arleigh Burke did in 1985. And it's classified as a small combatant.
Right.
It's not a small combatant. I'm looking to find a way to build actual goodness small combatants that can be built in much larger numbers, by more yards and more people, so that we're not locked in with only 7 shipyards that are currently building at their capacity. Will that require some degree of culture change on the part of the Navy? I guess so, because of the resistance to small combatants in the past, but that culture change should not be so huge because it's not a hydrofoil.
Right, okay, so if I could follow up, if that's all right. So typically, this kind of a ship has short legs, right? So you're going to want to forward deploy it, which implies tenders or forward basing, et cetera. And it's not an Aegis ship. So I have to get the mentality of, okay, it's a less capable surface combatant, and I just don't know how if I build 2 of them, geez, I could probably buy another frigate. So the trade-off between a more capable warship and something that's less, that's the hard trade-off that we got to make. And I just challenge, and by the way, I'm a fan of this. I did my thesis in small combatants, but
right.
I just don't know how we get over the culture that we've got today.
I'm not disagreeing with the challenges that would be behind that. At the same time, as I look around and I think about solutions, I think this is one that needs to be. It is certainly an option that should be actively considered and analyzed in more detail than I think that we have so far. I always felt like with the LUSV that we should have gone down a path where it was sort of, at best, optionally unmanned. Whereas you design the ship with a crew, and then and start building it, and then as technology evolves and you can get more automated automation in that ship, so that maybe in some flight down the road, after 5 or 10 ships or whatever number it might be, you can get at least an optionally unmanned function out of it, or even ultimately one day a completely unmanned function. But the other advantage to a small combatant that an unmanned platform does not have is that you can use it for a lot of other things. The adjunct magazine's important, it's valuable, but it's only going to do that one mission. It's not like you're using LUSVs to make port calls or engagement with allies or any potential maritime interception operation. And I don't want to load too many missions on that ship. But still, you can do some other things with that in a way that you can't do with an unmanned ship.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Hey, good morning. Ken Perry, violating Rule 1, never follow. Sully Sullivan. And your horizon of shipbuilding gap between shipbuilding plans and actual, we're well into what's been called the Davidson window,
Yes.
as you know, forecasting the potential or predicting the potential for China invasion of Taiwan by 2027. If all of your good ideas and options were adopted this week, when might they deliver meaningful increase in distributed lethality and numbers of platforms?
Well, if you're talking about the missile corvette, that would not come. That, in my view, that would not come within the Davidson window in the 2027 timeframe. It would come sometime after that. I would think that even if you adopted that one right now, you would take at least 5 years, if not a little bit more, before you could get the first one out there. But the idea being that once you go down that path, you could start maybe producing those in significantly larger numbers for the by the early 2030s. I do think you do have some potential within the Davidson window timeframe, say that's 2027 or 2028 timeframe for missile merchants. Now, to be sure, we have challenges in the munitions industrial base too. So there's no point in building ships if you don't have the munitions to put in them. So there is that component as well. But you can certainly do missile merchants within a year or two. You could do some retrofitting of the amphibious and logistics ships, I think, within a 2-year time period as ships come in. But that your fastest one is going to be the missile merchants. The second fastest will be retrofitting existing ships that don't have missiles. Bolting on canisterized missiles onto some of these platforms would not be that hard to do. It just would be a question of the Navy being able to schedule them within the other demands that are on those ships already. But the missile corvette, that's going to take a little bit of time. But I think it's worth the potential of looking at in more detail for down the road, because there was an interesting analysis that I read just the other day about whether, given how much Xi is involved in purging what he views as corruption within his military establishment, whether he really will be in a position to consider the 2027 as a viable option or not. It's not like he said he's going to war in 2027. Yep. He just wants to have it as an option. And he might not actually have that option given the challenge that he is currently facing within his own military organization. So, thank you. Bill, thank you very much.
Eric, I always feel like I'm looking at a problem without my glasses on, and then when Eric talks, it's like I've put my glasses on and things become much more clear. Eric, thank you for your time today. On behalf of the Naval Institute and our audience, we'd like to give you a copy of The Neptune Factor, a book by Nicholas Lambert, published by the Naval Institute Press, Alfred Thayer Mahan, and The Concept of Sea Power. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.